Weisafye Hale. So anyone who follows this channel will know that I like to, put a lot of emphasis on Old English as a spoken language. It was a real form of communication between the early medieval English, also known as the Anglo-Saxons, from around 450 AD to 1066, when it begins to get reclassified as Middle English. Now, it's difficult to get a real sense of how normal people communicated in an ancient language, mostly because the actual literature that we have, that is poetry, church sermons, philosophy, theology, chronicles, things like that, is very sort of, highbrow. That is, the people who were writing those things had no reason to write down what the normal person sounded like, because they could just hear that on the streets every day. However, we do have the ability to reconstruct aspects of colloquial Old English. And today I wanted to specifically talk about insults. So what would you say if you were mad at someone, if you wanted to insult them? I was surprised to learn when I started researching this that we actually have a good amount of information. So let's start with the basics. The word insult in Old English can be rendered in a couple different ways, but I want to highlight two in particular. That was bismorword and frakothword. Those translate roughly to sort of a word of mocking and literally a bad word, a frakothword. That is sort of like a vile word, a detestable word. But in modern English, colloquial modern English, we would probably call that something like a bad word. To insult someone, the verb was busmerian. So if you wanted to kind of be weird, you could say, I will insult you. That is, ich busmeriethe. That is, I'm going to insult you, or I insult you. Now, where do we get the actual sort of words that they would say to each other? The actual bismorword that they would say to each other? Most of these actually come from the Bible, if you'll believe it. The Bible is an extremely useful text in Old English because it not only has, a lot of conversation. Christ often talks with people in a sort of a colloquial manner, but we know a lot more about Latin than we know about Old English. So if there's something that we know in Latin, we can just go and see if it's in the Bible somewhere and if they've translated it into Old English. So for an example, there is a word in Latin, stulte, which means idiot. That's a vocative term of the adjective stultus, which means like a stupid person. The adjective means stupid, stultus. And to call someone an idiot, you could say stulte. Now, that's in the Bible. There are a couple situations where someone calls another person stulte in the Bible. I think both of them are in the Gospel of Luke. It's worth mentioning that the Greek in this situation is apron. So that's a way in Greek to call someone a fool. So the Greek is apron, and then the Latin is stulte, or in the plural stulti. And this gets translated into three different Old English Gospels. So we have three different Old English renderings of the Gospel. One of them is an actual translation, and that's called the Wessex Gospel. That's into West Saxon. And then we have two glosses of the Gospel, so less sort of natural, more literal translations. Those are glosses. That is, every Latin word is glossed into Old English. And those are both Northumbrian texts. All three of these were from the 10th century. So there are two Northumbrian glosses, known as the Lindisfarne glosses and the Rushworth glosses. The MacRegol Gospels is also another word for those. And in these Gospels, the word stulte is glossed as unwisa and dusira. So Lindisfarne and Rushworth use unwisa, which is sort of unwise in modern English. So you unwise one, but it really more means like you fool, you idiot. And then in the Wessex Gospels, we have through dusira, that is you, literally in modern English that would be you dizzy one, but the word actually means like you fool, you idiot. This also shows up in two homilies, one from the Blickling homilies and one from the Vercelli homilies. So we can get a sense that in Northumbrian, perhaps the most common way to call someone an idiot was unwisa, and in West Saxon and perhaps Mercian, the word would have been more like duzera. So there we have it. That's one way to call someone an idiot. In perhaps Northumbrian, in the 10th century, you have thu unwisa. And then in West Saxon or Mercian in the 10th century, you have thu duzera. We have a few other words that are very useful to us. There is a famous Aramaic insult, reika, and that means something like fool, idiot. Gets translated into Greek as raka, and then into Latin as raka. And again, so in all of those languages, it carries its meaning of you idiot, you fool. And in Matthew 5:22, Christ says, if anyone calls their brother raka, then that, it's a bad thing, they should be punished. And we have, obviously, 3 different attempts to translate this word in Old English. The Northumbrian ones, again, are the same. So Lindisfarne and Rushworth or MacGregor both give idla. Idla is where we get the word idle from, that is sort of not doing anything. But in Old English, it had a really negative, pejorative connotation. It meant someone who, it's sort of like ne'er-do-well. Thu idla, you useless human being. And so that's the Northumbrian translation. And then in the Wessex Gospels, we have awardena. So that means like you degenerate. You sort of useless human being. It might be a good way to translate that into like colloquial modern English. So again, in Northumbrian, we have thu idla, and then in Wessex, we have thu awardena. The next word used in that same passage in Greek is more, which is where we get the word moron from, and also sophomore. And in Latin, that gets translated by St. Jerome as fatue, which means fool, idiot. Now that one in the Lindisfarne Gospels gets translated as unwisa again. So here, the Lindisfarne translator, glossator named Aldred, uses the word unwisa for both fatue and for stulte. Unwisa. So to Aldred, this word was pretty common. That must have been in his repertoire. We can reasonably assume that if Aldred wanted to call someone stupid, he would have used the term thu unwisa. And then the Rushworth or MacGregor Gospels give dola, which is where we get the modern word dolt or dullard. It literally means dull. So, you dumb person, or again, dullard or dolt is where we get this word from. So that's another Northumbrian gloss. The West Saxon gloss, or translation, I should say, gives stunta, which is where we get the modern English word stunted from. So, this one would again mean someone who is not really all there in the head. You stunted person, you stunta, thu stunta is how it would have perhaps been pronounced in 10th century West Saxon. So, thanks to these Bible glosses, we have these 3 Latin insults, that is stulte, raka, and fatue, that are translated into 6 Old English insults. We have unwisa, idla, dola, stunta, awardena, and duzera. So if you wanted to insult your friend, I don't condone insulting people in mean spirits, but if you were going to insult your friend in Old English, the way to do it would be to apply thu at the beginning, that is, you are calling them directly, that word. And then for masculine objects, it would be thu unwisa. For feminine objects, it would be thu unwise. But yeah, you would apply that weak adjective, the nominative weak singular adjective ending. In plural, you would use an for both sexes. And yeah, you could say thu idle, thu unwisa, thu duzera. That is, you worthless person, you degenerate, you idiot. Just like that, that's a great place to start. We have a couple other insults borrowed from Latin, probably. In especially post-classical Latin, it became common to refer to people in sort of an abusive way as diabole, that is, you devil, or canis, that is, you dog. And we have both of those in Old English translations of those Latin insults. So devil would be the Old English word for devil, and then hund would be the Old English word for dog. And so we have lines like thu unmerma hund, that is, you worthless dog, in Old English. Probably difficult to say whether or not it's a natural insult, but probably understandable. It's not a good thing to call someone a dog to their face. So you could also use that one. I think my favorite attested insult in Old English is from a translation of a Latin saint's life. So again, not entirely organic, but the translator was clearly writing what he thought to be a good, real Old English translation of the Latin text. And he writes, Thu stunta, ond se master dwas, the avre on thisere buri was. That is, you idiot, and the greatest fool that was ever in this city. That's a pretty tough put down. There's one more that I wanted to mention, and that is a 12th century insult. So not really textbook Old English, but I still thought it was a good one. It's from the fictional laws of St. Edward the Confessor, written in about the 12th century, probably as a way to sort of justify the tradition of the Norman laws, yada, yada, yada. Not really sure who wrote it or why, but it's probably 12th century. But it does have one thing which is almost certainly real, and that is information on an insult in West Saxon, specifically Exeter. The Latin text reads, Occidentales Saxonici, scilicet execastrenses, habent in proverbio summi despectus, quod summa ira commotus, unus vocat alterum hinderling, id est ab omni honestate deictum. So, the West Saxons, specifically the Exonians, that is people from Exeter, have a sort of proverb. When one person is really mad, they will call the other person hinderling, that is hated by, or sort of thrown down or cast away by all honest people, by every honest person. Hinderling means like a backwards person, that is like hinder, and then ling is this sort of diminutive suffix that we have. We also see that in the word atheling, which means a little nobleman, that is a prince. Hinderling seems to have been a pretty serious insult, not one that you want to just throw around. The Latin is summa ira, that is in the highest anger, sort of the worst anger, you will say this word hinderling, to really sort of put someone in their place. I hope you found this interesting. Everybody insults each other, and every language has insults, and Old English is no different. If you came to this video seeking instructions on how to insult someone in Old English, I really can't think of better material to give you than these glosses, these translations, these words that we have here. If you like content like this, be sure to check out the rest of my channel. Kindly consider subscribing or becoming a supporter on Patreon. If not, no worries. I'm happy to just have you as a viewer. Until next time, Farath Ye Yesunde.